Welcome back, Rebels, for another video on Star Wars Destiny, this wonderful collectible card game that we all love to love. And if I'm the first video that you've seen since Empire of War dropped, then let me begin by saying welcome to the new order. A new set brings with it new cards, and with that comes a new meta. So right now, you should all be having fun just putting together your janky Hera vehicle decks, or your Sabine decks, or your direct damage hate decks with the new Kylo and his silly crossguard lightsaber and whatever other shenanigans you can think of. Because this is a great time in Destiny. In fact, this is the freest time you're going to have because you get to experiment and have fun. Because nobody knows what's going to be competitive just yet. So just mess around and have a good time because I'm not going to judge you, and I'd hope that the people at your local store also aren't going to judge you. So back to the topic at hand. On the last video, I was debating on what to cover next, and I did get a little tiny bit of feedback. And from that, I decided I would talk to you today about choosing the right battlefield for your deck. Now, as a disclaimer, I want to clarify that I can't tell you exactly what battlefield you should use because there are just far too many character groupings to predict the best one for your particular deck. I mean, without seeing your deck list, I can't really give you one correct answer, but what I can provide you with are guidelines that can serve you going forward in choosing that ideal battlefield for any deck that you're going to make in the future. And I'm going to try to explain the thought process behind the selection of the battlefields and give you some examples on how all of this has already been put into practice. So I hope you guys are excited as I am to talk about this. So let's get going after this. Every deck in Destiny is 30 points of characters, 30 cards, and one battlefield. It's weird how battlefield selection is overlooked often in deck creation, though. And what I mean by that is it's not a very covered or discussed topic. In fact, I think I've seen one article on it in the past and not much more beyond that. And it definitely deserves to be talked about more because there's a lot of thought that goes into selecting the one battlefield you take with you to a game. With Empire at War dropping, there's even more thought that's going to be going into battlefield selection because they've not only added new battlefields, but also a new type of battlefield, one with control abilities or passive abilities, as some might call them. And those are a lot different than the just, hey, you claim it and something happens battlefield. So we're going to talk a little bit about those today as well. The choice of your battlefield can be made before or even after you've created a deck. Oftentimes, it's chosen after a deck has been created and for a very good reason. So let's talk about that first. When you're constructing your deck, you might ask yourself somewhere along the way if you want this pile of cards you're throwing together into something called a deck to be battlefield-centric or not. And what this means is that claim and or control of your battlefield is very important to the overall theme and even maybe win con for your deck. And some people would say then that your battlefield has a high impact on your game. Likewise, there are also battlefields that have a low impact, and we'll talk about some generally accepted high impact and low impact battlefields regardless of deck type a little later in the video. And what players have found at very high levels of play is that it isn't always a good idea just to seek battlefields that have a high impact for your deck. It's actually really, really risky. And in fact, it's a bad idea to consider, the impact of a battlefield and nothing beyond that. And there's, again, a lot of risks involved to this. And we're going to cover a lot of that stuff in this video as well. In fact, what I want you to do to get a grasp on this one is imagine for a moment that your battlefield is like that one really amazing card in your deck that you're trying to draw. And that card is very closely tied to your win condition. In fact, it may even enable you to win. And then as you're going through the course of the game, you just can't draw it. You'd be putting all your eggs in one basket if you built a deck like that. So you shouldn't do that for your battlefield either. And for that simple reason, you don't want to rely too heavily on claiming or controlling the battlefield for your win con, because to do so is going to make your deck very weak and possibly even unable to stand on its own if your battlefield isn't chosen for the game. Now, as with every guideline, there are exceptions. We just talked about high impact and low impact battlefields as a concept, right? And what this idea illustrates at its core is that battlefields can have different levels of impact. And when a battlefield and a deck work really well together as, say, part of a combo deck or something like that, they're said to have synergy. Good battlefield synergy means your battlefield supports your deck idea or has some good level of impact for you, and therefore it's good to have control of my battlefield or to use its claim ability. But it's also not going to break my deck if I don't have either of those things. So for example, there was a Qui-Gon Rey deck that was pretty popular all throughout the Awakenings and the SOR meta, and still is. I even still have this deck built. And the battlefield of choice for that deck generally was considered Echo Base. And the simple reason is that claiming this battlefield gives you a shield. And if Qui-Gon has a shield, effectively that claim translates to 1 damage to an opponent's character. And that's really cool. On the other hand, if you don't claim the battlefield, that's okay. It's not going to make or break your win con, and that's fine. You know, your whole game plan isn't going to crumble into dust just because you didn't claim. It's just really helpful and really cool and synergistic if you do claim. And a battlefield that only has a good level of synergy is said to generally only have high impact for you. And there's very, very few battlefields that are actually like this in the game. And I want to note that Echo Base actually is no longer considered the battlefield of choice for the mono blue Qui-Gon deck. Since the 2-player game was released, a battlefield with an even higher synergy for this deck became available in Obi-Wan's Hut. It's basically the same thing, but this time it only benefits blue characters, and everyone else who wants to get a shield out of it has to pay a resource. So this battlefield can be said to actually have a higher synergy and have a higher impact in a mono blue deck than Echo Base does, because it's so specific on its claimability just for blue characters. So this is pretty neat, and it's a good way to illustrate synergy with battlefields. Earlier, I mentioned that there are risk factors involved when making your deck battlefield-centric, but in reality, there are risk factors involved when selecting a battlefield, period. So I'm going to go through as many of these as I can for you in the video, and what I want you to note is that this is sort of the meat and potatoes of the guidelines right here in these few upcoming sections. The first factor that you might consider strongly when choosing a battlefield is the speed of your deck. You can generally determine the speed of your deck in a number of ways. You might solo play the deck at home, you might try it out on Tabletop Simulator, you might just take it to a casual game night at the local store. And what you want to determine is roughly how many actions it's going to take before you can reasonably claim. You can take, notes, or you can feel it out, however you like. The speed of the deck is often determined by the characters, first and foremost, and then the number of events you want to play or have to play, then the number of supports in your deck, and of course, how many times you're going to need to discard to reroll. And, that's hard to know, of course, but you can try to assume you're going to reroll at least once per round, barring Maz or some other character or event being able to fix your dice or resolve multiple dice at once, kind of like all in or something like that. So the reason you want to consider speed is that in a speedy deck, you claim more often and more consistently. Thus, if you bring a battlefield that synergizes really well with your deck and you can win the roll-off and choose it, you're probably going to have an edge, assuming, of course, that you can handle the 2 shields that you're giving to the opponent. On the flip side, if your deck is slow and methodical in its actions, needing to resolve everything to its maximum, you are unlikely to ever claim the battlefield, regardless of which was in play, yours or theirs. So speed of your deck is probably the largest factor in how consistently you're going to claim. And a speedy deck like, let's say, a Poe Maz claims nearly every round because it can complete all its actions in about 3 or 4 turns. And most decks are taking many more actions, so it's less likely that they will claim. And that's going to lead us right into our next guideline. Matchups are another consideration when selecting your battlefield. Now, this consideration can't be examined in a vacuum, and to clarify, You have to know your local meta to some extent, and you have to ask yourself if you're willing to let your opponent have your battlefield if you lose a roll off at the start of the game. Because if that happens, now you've given them a choice to use your battlefield, which might also help them, and they also get shields. So that's a really, really tricky decision to make. So, for example, a battlefield like Emperor's Throne Room has been very popular in high level play for the simple reason that it allows you to turn a die into a special and resolve it. And this has benefited a whole lot of decks, notably Poe Maz, Emo Kids, which can turn that claim into 3 or more damage pretty easily. And that's a very powerful way to end a turn because it saves them a die resolution and it does damage. On the other hand, matchups may not be a consideration whatsoever to choosing a battlefield. You see, I told you every guideline has an exception, and I was not kidding. So hear me out on this one. Going back to the idea of high impact, there are also battlefields you might choose to select for your deck simply because they have no impact or very low impact. So what I mean is that whether you claim or your opponent claims, the effect of its claimability or passive effect is so minimal to the game in general, or maybe even the specific matchup, that it makes little or no difference on the actual outcome. So what you're actually doing is selecting a low impact battlefield on purpose. And there are a number of battlefields that people often choose to use for their decks just because they have little or no impact on the game whatsoever. And there's no battlefield that really synergizes super well with their decks. So again, some of that stuff, those decisions are very deck dependent, as in what deck archetype are you going to play? And other times you just choose that battlefield because it doesn't benefit the big decks in the meta whatsoever. So why not? All right, so let's take a look at some of those low impact battlefields that I've been referring to throughout the video so far. So the first one is Otogunga, and it's a battlefield that you might often see run in a Palpatine deck because for Palpatine, it actually has really good synergy and a fair or moderate impact on its actual deck. It can heal a single point of damage, which might be the difference between lasting another round or dying this round, but more often than not, that's simply just not the case because in Destiny, 1 damage is relatively easy to produce, and in most aggro decks. So Otogunga is generally considered to be fairly low impact. In fact, it's so low impact that more and more villain mill decks have begun to run it for its heal ability too. Kind of. Why run it over a great on paper super synergizing battlefield like Command Center? Well, 2 reasons, right? First, mill decks are very, very slow, and they don't often claim against a large portion of the decks in the meta. And 2, losing 2 cards from your opponent claiming it from you off your deck is pretty terrible when you consider the first point, that you're never claiming. So you make a different choice in the end, and you pick a choice that's fairly low impact, something like Otogunga. Now, another low impact battlefield in the game right now is most likely Spaceport. Now, this battlefield can actually be pretty good and have some impact if you're running a bunch of zero cost upgrades. It would just be essentially giving you a resource for free at the cost of an action to replay the upgrade that you bounce to your hand in the next round of play. Now, that might be a good trade-off in a deck with, let's say, Rey, right? You pick up your 4 speed and you're able to get a resource for it, and then next turn you play that again and she gets an extra action, right? But generally speaking, there are very few times where you'd actually want to bounce an upgrade back to your hand for that 1 resource outside of that. So this battlefield is actually said to have a very low impact on the board state in general, and sometimes just gets put on someone's deck and on the board for that exact reason. So since we talked about low impact battlefields, I guess it's only fair that we talk about some high impact battlefields, right? Now, there's a couple of these, and I will point out why each one can be considered high impact in the right deck. So the first one we're going to talk about is Carbon Freezing Chamber, and one might argue that Carbon Freezing Chamber, or CFC, is the highest impact battlefield in the entire game. It has great rewards that come with great risk. And for that reason, you will hardly ever see this battlefield play, because if your opponent claims this against you even once, it can slow down your entire game. Remember that character dice are generally considered the most powerful dice in the table, and so losing one for an entire turn or round can swing a game in a really bad way against you. So you'll see this battlefield on occasion in decks that run Snap Wexley, like a base Snap deck, because he has a claim tax associated with him, and he can disrupt your opponent's resource at the same time to prevent them from paying that resource tax. So without a character like Snap, you'd have to be really certain that your deck is way faster than every other opponent's deck in the meta, no matter what. And that's really, really tough to guarantee. Frozen Waste is another high-impact battlefield in Destiny. On claim, it allows you to remove a character die from the pool. So more often than not, you'll be using this on an opponent's die. But if you find yourself in a situation where you're leaving like a 3-range damage for one resource die out because you couldn't pay for it, and you think, oh, my opponent might have a deflect or reversal in their hand to do damage, you can remove your own character die too. So as I mentioned earlier when we were talking about Carbon Freezing Chamber, character die, they're generally the most powerful die on the table in most of the games you're going to play in Destiny. So Frozen Waste can be a clutch battlefield claim right at the end of your round, giving it a potentially high impact on your game, because now you're removing a die that you would not be able to normally remove because you claimed and you now forfeit all your actions. But this last action is letting you take a die off the table, which is pretty cool. So now this third one here is the classic that we've talked about, and it's Emperor's Throne Room. And Throne Room is great in decks that use a lot of special sides to generate damage or special effects, like I've already mentioned. And specials are quite varied in Destiny, and claiming to make a die into a special and then also being able to resolve it has the potential to be super powerful. I mean, think about what this is simulating, right? It's essentially focusing a die to a special and then letting you resolve it all in one claim action. It's a 2-for-1, right? So, and I've said in the past in other videos, and I'm sure other content creators are always talking about it, when you do 2 things for 1, that's usually pretty great. So Emperor's Throne Room makes an excellent case for why that 2-for-1 thing is pretty good. And one of the things I want to highlight with this trend in high impact battlefields, and just looking at these 3 so far, is that they all have something in common, and it's the way they manipulate die in some way, either by removing it or forcing an outcome or resolving them, or 2 of those 3 things. And these battlefields are considered high impact almost across the board because they do things that are universally considered pretty good in Destiny. Now, of course, you could have a deck that doesn't use any specials, and your opponent may be playing a deck that has no specials. So no one's playing Emperor's Throne Room. So that Throne Room, in that scenario would have no impact whatsoever on the board state. But no one would ever put this card in their deck like they would put Mos Eisley or Otogunga, with the idea of, this battlefield's not going to have an impact on the game at all, because there's going to be someone's card that has a special, somewhere. So, things that you might use to make one or more events happen in Destiny, again, like these particular battlefields, again, they're good, and these battlefields do that in one swift action. So let's take a look at battlefields that do things like this for your deck. You want to take a look at battlefields like that. You want to weigh the pros and the cons against the local meta or the global meta or the larger regional meta, depending on the tournament you go to. And you want to take into consideration the speed of your deck, right, and the synergy that this battlefield's going to have your deck before choosing something like this. Because remember, it can also stab you in the back when you least expect it. He's back. So when I was talking about Port District and other battlefields with active abilities, it brought to mind another great concept that isn't talked about a great deal either, and that concept is called claim tension. Claim tension is an integral part of Destiny, and its existence can change how you play out an entire round. So let me tell you what it is. Claim tension is a situation that players in the game experience when they know that if one player claims, the benefit of claiming will be very advantageous to that player. During a claim tension situation, both players are constantly in a mental battle between 2 choices. They either do X or they claim. It's no longer, Do I play this card or that card? Do I roll this die or re-roll this die? Do I activate this character or remove something? No. Every single decision-making point becomes weighed against the option to claim. And the longer the round goes on, the higher and higher the claim tension gets until someone either claims at the appropriate time or someone breaks the claim tension by claiming early, which is what people usually say to describe that particular break in the claim tension. Now, I say that claim tension is often a product of two players recognizing a clear benefit to someone claiming. And that benefit can be the claimability itself, or the impact of controlling the battlefield going into the next round, such as, getting to go first, or having access to some cards that now become online because they have controlled the battlefield, things like defensive position, Krennic's ability to roll a Death Trooper die, things like that. But it could very well be a card that's already in play as well. And there is one particular card in Destiny that causes a great deal of claim tension, and that's Planetary Uprising. And the reason it causes such claim tension between players isn't necessarily attributed to which battlefield is being claimed, but just that the simple act of claiming triggers its ability. And with two of these on the table, the claim tension becomes very high, and the player without Planetary Uprising oftentimes has their entire round spent in the mindset of weighing every turn against claiming. It stinks. And some might even say it's unfair, but I mean, heroes got to be good at something, right? Now that we've talked about a few different factors for determining how to choose your battlefield, I want to talk about some actual cards you might put in your deck that can have an impact on which battlefields you choose if you win the roll-off. Remember that those two shields that you take at the start of the game are kind of like 2 extra hit points in some cases, so you might want to take your opponent's battlefield just to get them, right? But then, how will you ever see your battlefield again? And if you don't already know the answer to that question, then prepare to be amazed. Before you are 3 cards that actually allow you to manipulate something about the battlefield. All 3 of these cards see play, in fact, to varying degrees, of course. And the one in the middle is the first one I want to talk about, and that's Ascension Gun. This is a pretty nice 2-cost upgrade that has some damage sides and was filling a niche before the X8 Night Sniper came about, I think. But its special is what really makes it, special, I guess. It allows you to use the battlefield ability on the battlefield that is not in play. So if you remember back a few minutes ago when I spoke about villain mill decks not wanting to run Command Center, well, with Ascension Gun, you have the best of both worlds. Bring the battlefield to the game, and then don't select it if you win the roll-off. Because it's unlikely that if your opponent wins the roll-off that they're going to take your battlefield, right? I mean, what's the chances that they're also playing mill? I mean, it's possible. But chances are they're going to choose theirs. And if you win the roll-off, you can really confuse them, choose their battlefield, and take the shields instead. And in both cases, you can use Ascension Gun to proc the claim ability to Command Center and mill 2 cards from their deck. It's pretty genius, right? So now the card on the left is Hyperspace Jump. And this one's hero only, but it allows you to do a couple of things here. Firstly, it ends the action phase. That means you stop what you're doing and you go straight to the upkeep. It then gives you the option to swap the battlefields and play. What it doesn't do is it doesn't use the claim ability, nor does it give you control of the battlefield. But that's okay, because in some cases, you can set up future turns where you'll want to use the claim ability if you lost the roll-off initially and your battlefield wasn't chosen. The third card on the right is New Orders, and New Orders has basically been a one-of include in any deck that uses a high-impact battlefield that is fast enough to outclaim the opponent most times. You might even see 2 copies of it in some decks. And lately I've seen it show up in competitive deck lists less and less, and I'm not sure if that's because it's fallen out of favor or if it's being pushed out by higher impact cards in general. But New Orders will always be a card to watch out for as long as it's legal in play. And the great thing about it is that it not only switches the battlefield like Hyperspace Jump can do, and then it also allows you to use the claim ability without actually claiming the battlefield. So if you run a fast deck, you might actually be able to claim later in the turn again, so you can use the claim ability twice. And that can be pretty swingy in a game, so you shouldn't underestimate this card. And I do want to highlight that there's other cards that do different things that can impact battlefields as well. So please note that this is not an exhaustive list of all the cards that have some form of battlefield manipulation that currently exists in Destiny. All right, so we talked about a lot of concepts sort of all at once, and now we've got to consolidate all this information into a nice, brief summary. Because I know you weren't writing any of this down, were you? That's okay, but next time remember to take notes because there could be a quiz at any time. Can you imagine a pop quiz for Star Wars Destiny? I don't even know if I'd be prepared for that. So, all right, anyway, here are the guidelines on one slide for you. Let's review. So the first thing is to remember to consider synergy with your deck. Synergy is good, but not at the cost of taking a risky battlefield just to try to synergize all the time. You have to remember that you want to consider impact and do the high versus low impact analysis on a battlefield. Ask yourself, how much does my battlefield benefit me versus benefits all my potential opponents' battlefields? We took a look at some battlefields that were low impact and some that were high impact. And the higher impact of a battlefield, the more power it exerts over the game state by removing cards or a die or allowing you to do two things at once. So remember to keep that in mind when you're doing that impact analysis. And you want to remember, always keep an eye on your local meta. Knowing key matchups is really important, and keeping an eye on the evolving state of the game is very, very important. So you want to consider things like the one-time claim abilities versus the new passive battlefields, because some of these new battlefields might really pack a punch and they may become part of your local meta or the overall meta. We then talked about claim tension and how that can really, really impact the game. Remember that it can be important to leverage claim tension in your favor by putting cards in your deck that allow you to create some additional claim tension or to take advantage of claim abilities in general. We then took a look at cards that make exceptions to the rules of choosing the starting game battlefield and that can manipulate the present battlefield in some way. And if you include some of these cards in your deck, think about how they create not only claim tension, but how they synergize with your deck and what sort of impact they have and how they favor you in matchups. Basically all the things in this list that are above this. And that's kind of why we talked about it at the very end of the video. And remember that knowing these guidelines are going to help you select better battlefields for the deck that you want to build, but also keep in mind that there's exceptions to every one of these guidelines here, and you have to consider those too. Well, that's a wrap, folks. I really hope that you got a lot out of this video, as always, because knowing how to select a good battlefield for your deck can be a really high impact or even a purposely low impact decision for your games. And you know, battlefield selection is part of deck building. It's not something separate. And so everyone should learn these guidelines and find others along the way and share them too. Because I sure as heck don't know everything. I'm just a guy who plays Destiny, and I do fairly well in competitive play, I guess. But that doesn't make me an authority on the game or all of its little nuances. But I sure try to figure things out and then come here and share them with you on my channel. And I like to think people are watching and getting stuff out of this. So here's to you for stopping by to actually learn something. And I know I appreciate it, and maybe now you're a better Destiny player. Keep my fingers crossed. So with that, I want to wish you all the best in your upcoming games, and remember to have fun with the new cards in this freest of times in our meta. And if you want to follow everything I'm doing, subscribe to me here on YouTube by hitting that button down there. And if you want to check out my Facebook page and my other links below, have at it. So that said, I'll see you next time for another video where I'll be bringing you some more teachable moments in Star Wars Destiny. And good luck on your card chase, and may the Force be with you.